Well, it's time to head out into the great outdoors, and with the fantastic weather that we had at the weekend, a lot of us were out and about again and making the most of the fine weather. I'm joined by nature guide Angus Kennedy, well known to us here on the show, of course, from Nature Northwest. Angus, how are you getting on?
I'm very good, John. How are you?
Good. I was out this morning for a wee walk before coming in and heard that distinctive squeaky wheelbarrow song.
Very good. The Goldcrest.
Yes. And
our smallest bird. Yeah, great. Yeah, and it's always nice when you can hear that and register it, because you know your hearing isn't going. It's still good and sharp because it's right on the edge of our frequency range. You know.
Yeah, well, he was making himself known this morning. Anyhow. Now let's chat about another a small bird, and a very common one at that, the Willow Warbler, and it's a summer visitor. And here through until, what, about September?
Through to September. I'll play the song first, okay, and we'll see, do people recognise it. It's one of the most common songs that's out there from now on. So I'll play this one sec now. It's a very distinctive little song. These birds, they pour back in to Ireland just over the last week or so. They really are an April bird. And they start coming in. They come in from deep Africa, and they come south of the Sahara. Tiny little greeny, browny, olive-coloured bird. Yeah. And they're our most common migrant after the swallow.
And that the little bit you played us, it is recognisable, but that's sung over and over and over again. It's repeated, isn't it?
It's repeated again and again and again. The males arrive first, and when they arrive in early April with the southerly winds, so people might have noticed the lovely weather the last few days, and we've had a few swallows arriving and other birds as well. But with the southerly winds that we had and the warmer weather, up come huge amounts of these willow warblers and lots of other migrants too. And the males arrive first, and the very first thing they do is start singing, because they know they're up. It's a race against time. They only have a few months to be able to establish a territory, attract a mate, build a nest, lay their eggs, the whole thing, and they have to get all that done before the end of summer, really.
They're very similar to look at to the chiff-chaff.
They are. If you had the two of them in the hand, they nearly look identical. They're very, very similar. The chiff-chaff arrives a little bit earlier. They arrive kind of mid to late March or so, and they have a very different song. And the big thing with the chiff-chaff also is, as they spread out over these weeks, they like slightly kind of different habitat. The chiff-chaff likes tall trees, tall vegetation, whereas the willow warbler likes willow typically, which is small, and many other small little shrubs. So they'll arrive. I'm lucky enough to have a few willow trees right outside my office window in my house here. And I see willow warblers passing through every day, and they're picking away into the little tiny flowers, the little tiny catkins, all the bugs that are starting to emerge. So they've timed their arrival perfectly with all these bugs that have been hibernating as little eggs, or cocooning as little eggs over the winter time, and now they've come out en masse, and the willow warblers are here to benefit out of that. And as a result, they're doing a huge pest control job for us as well. But it's such a lovely song, and it's such a well-known song, that it's often used in TV and documentaries and things like that to show us the change from winter to summer, or from winter to spring. And I think it's a reminder to us all that a lot of people often say, oh, I don't know bird song, or I don't really hear too much, or I don't tune into it. It's going into our brains all the time. But our brains are just, a lot of the time, unless we're tuned into it ourselves, we're pushing it to one side. But if we can just open up that little bit, and now is the perfect opportunity to stop and just listen a bit more. There's less ambient sound all around in our towns and in the countryside. And these birds are singing their little hearts out. And it is so well known that advertising agencies use it to try and get us to buy summer products. So it must be going in there, and it must be well imprinted on our brains.
You summed it up very well, and we tend to push the sounds to one side when we're not aware of what they're coming from, or we can't name the birds, or the birds aren't familiar to us. We don't recognise them. So with the willow warbler, have you got access to that to the little bird song again? And it's such a common one. And it's got a nice tone to it as well.
We'll play it again here now. So it's a very sweet little sound.
Yes, very melodic.
And it starts off high and drops down. Did you hear that okay?
Yeah, definitely one of the nicer ones. All right, well, that's the...
Yeah, and it often reminds me, if you're trying to decipher which sound, because somebody else was emailing me this morning and said, listen, there's an awful lot of bird song out there, which is which. But that sound, it's very high, very kind of dreamy, and it goes down, down, down. But a reminder, a way I reminded myself when I was starting to learn them, it's as if it hasn't quite made up its mind by the end of it. At the end, it kind of tapers off, as if it thinks, that wasn't a good enough job, I better try again. And it starts the song again, and it repeats it and repeats it and repeats it, and we will hear that song right up until the end of June now. And it's everywhere, be it in the heart of Dublin City, or the most remote part. You'll get these on our islands, our offshore islands occasionally. They go everywhere. As they go as far, having come from southern or mid-Africa, south of Sahara, they'll go as far as the Arctic Circle in search of good habitats with good shrubbery and whatnot.
Wow.
It's amazing how far these little tiny birds can spread.
Yeah, for such a small bird. Now, a caller has 2 plum trees, but as soon as they start to fruit, they're bombarded by wasps, which burrow holes in the fruit. Any suggestions? Wasps, well, wasps like sweet fruit, so it's inevitable.
It is inevitable. Wasps are amazing little creatures. They get bad press. At this time of year, we'll start seeing huge wasps, just like we see huge bumblebees. But you don't need to be afraid of them. They're not looking for us. And they're not coming near us, really. It's the queens that have been sleeping all winter long in soft mud all around us, really. And they emerge at this time of year and they establish their little nests, and they start building their nests, laying their eggs and so on. Then the worker wasps go out. They catch and hunt other bugs, same kind of bugs that the Willow Warbler is getting, and the same kind of bugs that might have eaten the leaves off the plum tree. So they're pest control. They'll catch those bugs, they bring them back to the nest, they feed them to more baby wasps, which in turn, now this sounds a bit strange, but in turn those baby wasps, they eject a strange kind of sugary liquid. And that's what the adult wasps eat. And they eat that all summer long. So that's why people don't really notice wasps until the end of summer, when the plum tree is coming, or the fruit is coming ripe. Because then the adults, their job is redundant. The new queens have gone off to hibernate themselves. There's no more babies to feed, so the adults come to the bottle bank, or come to your picnic, or if you've just eaten some chocolate or something sweet, they'll come to us and we start noticing them. And of course they'll come to the fruit, because there's no more babies with that funny sweet liquid to sustain them. And the first frost kills them off. So it's a battle. It's very difficult. You can put up nets to try and stop, say, the blackbirds getting your plums and your fruit and your strawberries and that kind of thing, but it's hard to stop the wasps.
Yeah, indeed. Now let's go from the willow warbler to the weeping willow or willow trees, and they're often called weeping, I presume, because of the shape, and that they hang down as like a head hung low, or is it because of that?
Yeah, well, there's many different types of willow. We've about 20 different species of willow in Ireland, many of which are native, and then there's another 20 plus hybrids. So different species of willow will breed with each other, so it can make it quite hard to identify. But the weeping willow tree is actually of Chinese origin, and it was brought in by garden centres and whatnot, and people in their big estates actually years ago would have brought them in originally. Very beautiful tree. They do well in Ireland. And they have the classic weeping way. But ordinary willow trees, your goat willow, which has the little longish green leaves, the things that people would have called the Sally or the pussy willow, if you leave them alone and they get mature enough, they will also start to weep under the weight of their own branches, and they can drop right down. I have a few willow trees in my own garden now that have been left alone. There's been the garden once upon a time was a field, and there would have been grazing animals in here. They're long gone. So the willow trees now droop all the way down as far as the grass, and they make like a lovely umbrella. And one of the things my 2 girls call the willow trees at this time of year, they call them the humming trees, because they have all their little flowers, or their catkins really, which is the pussy willow bit, and inside there's quite a lot of nectar, and the emerging bumblebees, they feast on this. So if you stand under a willow tree, and it won't last much longer, it's only another few days really, that time has nearly come and gone, but if you stand under a willow tree and just stay still for a few minutes and listen, you'll hear the whole thing humming, and it's gorgeous. And if you look up, then eventually you'll start spotting lots of different bumblebees up there.
Brilliant. Now, it likes damp soil. So is that one of the reasons that they thrive in Ireland?
Hence we've lots of them, especially in Donegal. But they love the wet. You could stick, and they propagate extremely easily as well. So those little catkins, once they're pollinated, and the bees pollinate them to a certain extent, they're pollinated by wind to a certain extent, but they will, in another few weeks' time, we will start seeing big wispy drifts of white, what looks like white dust or white fluff, and that's the seeds of the willow at the end of May. It's a lovely, lovely thing for a couple of days, and they spread vigorously. But also, you can cut off a piece of willow and stick it into the ground, and you have at least a 50-50 chance of it taking, and you can stick it into a wet, soggy puddle, and they're extremely tough, and so they love wet places, and in fact, they'll dry out a wet pit of the garden for you if you give them a chance. They'll often grow on the sides of riverbanks, and quite often they can act better as protection than some of our artificial ways of protecting the side of the river, because the root system will spread out and it'll bind the mud together. And of course they help stop flooding. So they're a very useful tree from all of those kind of point of views, and they support our lovely willow warbler and the bumblebees and the rest of it.
And I suppose we should be careful if we decide to plant one in the garden. We should be careful because some of them can grow to be a great height.
Some of the most of our native ones, they're not huge. They're more, they won't grow as big as an oak tree or something like that. In fact, a lot of them won't even grow quite as big as a birch tree. But some of the cultivar ones that are brought in can be huge, all right, yeah. So we need to be a little bit careful about which one you're putting in. But if you look around at some of the bushes, you will find them everywhere. Anybody today in Donegal, or in fact all over, going on their walk within their 2 kilometre area, they will come across willow many, many times. And one of the amazing things with willow is that you can coppice them. And coppicing means you can cut them down, and sometimes this can look quite brutal when you see a tree completely hacked down, but they will come back. So it's one of the reasons that they hold our hedges quite well, or they thrive in our hedges and do well there, because even when they're cut back every season after September, when the hedge cutting season opens again, when they're cut back every year, they will pop up again. And a willow tree can grow a willow rod of over 2 metres in just 1 year. So it's a phenomenal growth rate. And of course, all of the time, they're sucking down carbon dioxide, they're keeping that carbon, they're helping purify the air for us, and they're helping cool the earth at the same time. So they're an amazing little tree, but they're a very tough little tree. I wouldn't worry too much about popping them into the garden, as long as it's in a wet place, because they won't tend to spread out like, say, an aspen tree might. They won't spread by their suckers too much, and you can get rid of them reasonably easily if you have to.
They thrive in damp soil, as we mentioned, and you also made a good point about how they're good along river banks. And I think that they're beautiful near water, whether that's near a river or particularly maybe a pond or a lake. They're almost like a work of art if they're along water.
Yeah, they are. They're a stunning thing. This time of year, it's my favourite time of year, as I've said to you many times on the show. But one of the things I love about this time of year is all the different shades of green. There's so many different shades of green. And the green is very light on this time of year because the leaves haven't been pumped full of toxins. Those brand new little leaves have just emerged. They popped out of their buds, and they're growing as fast as they possibly can. The trees are pumping them full of water and full of sugars that they have stored in their roots from the sap. And the chlorophyll is being made, the green stuff is being made. Now, as time rolls on, those leaves will get a little bit darker in colour as the trees protect themselves by putting in things that the bugs won't like, effectively. But for now, you get all these various different, very light shades of green. If you think of the hawthorn and how light it is. And the willow's green is a particular kind of greyish green. It's got a greyish tinge to it. So again, if you're on your 2 kilometre walk today, look around you and look at some of the trees that are emerging. A lot of them haven't woken up yet. The oak and the ash haven't come out. The birch is only starting. The beech hasn't come out. Whereas the hawthorn will. It's a beautiful, vivid, bright green. And the willow has, and it's that kind of greyish green. So you can often tell them from a distance, especially at this time of year, by their colour. So you're right, stunningly beautiful. And the reflections of that picked up in a river or a still body of water are gorgeous. They also, by the way, aspirin, and most of us have taken aspirin at some stage. Aspirin came from the bark of a willow tree. So I think in our current crisis, it's an interesting thing to remember, because there's a lot of talk about nature and about origins of this disease that's out there at the moment. There's an awful lot of solutions in medicine in nature, and one of those solutions, the bark of the willow tree, chemicals in there is what gave rise to aspirin.
The ancient Greeks used to use the willow to make poultices, so they were onto it at a very early age.
So yeah, it's been going back a huge amount of time, and you'll often see animals chewing on young willow bark, not so much the tougher. Now, they like bark of lots of different young trees, it's nutritious, but I often wonder, is it because they know and they're getting some kind of benefit from this as well? And it's something nowadays, of course, that the aspirin is made in a laboratory. It's the same chemicals, but they're made synthetically or artificially. But that's where they get their origins from, and it's quite amazing. So many different solutions for our problems, our medical problems, are often found in nature.
From a very popular bird to a very popular tree to a very popular plant or flower, and very beautiful as well, and one that everybody knows, the primrose, and often described as the perfect spring flower.
And they are just gorgeous. They are just gorgeous, but they're two little shades of yellow. And if you look at them, they're a beautiful, light, kind of milky yellow, the primrose. But then when you look inside, it's worth stopping, looking really closely, and you'll see they've a slightly darker, deeper yellow ring in the centre of them. And they're little. The flowers that haven't emerged yet, they look just like a little rose, like a tiny miniature rose petal. So if you're passing and you spot a primrose, stop, bend down and have a little look inside, poke around and see if you can find one of the ones that haven't come out. Their name, Prima Rosa, comes from first rose, because quite often they're one of the very first plants to come out in springtime. And they're a woodland plant, of course, like so many of our spring flowers are adapted to woodland, so they're coming out before the canopy closes over, before all the leaves from the trees are there blocking the light. So they're using their the early energy from the sun to put out these gorgeous little flowers, which of course are all about pollination and fertilization.
And they're very hardy.
They're extremely tough little thing. The ones they like their bit of sunshine all the same. So the ones that will be on the sunny bank will open up first, and then the others will come out. They can come out as early as they've been December, probably more south of the country, or in the country really, than here. But they're certainly in bloom at the moment, and they're just gorgeous. And get out and have a look at them, because they won't be around for much longer. And when you do have get an opportunity to have a look at them, again, bend down, have a closer look, and see if you can see those two yellow colours inside, and see if you can see any of the tiny little beetles that are in there. Because, of course, all flowers have a problem. They need to get their pollen mixed from flower to flower. And primroses are usually either separately male or female. And not all flowers do that. So they'll either have a male or a female flower. So the pollen needs to be moved from one to the other. Now, bumblebees do that, of course, first. Butterflies do that first, or do that for the flowers. But there's tiny little beetles, and if you look inside the yellow flower, you'll see these teeny, only a couple of millimetres long, 3 or 4 millimetres long, and they're often covered in that yellow dust, the pollen. And those beetles fly from flower to flower. So it is thought that those beetles pollinate them and help fertilise the flower, which will turn into seeds eventually, of course.
And what I didn't know until I discovered and was reading up on them is that they're actually edible, and they can be decorated and used, on tops of cakes and so on.
And they often are. I'm always very slow to do that kind of thing in case they're washed properly and the rest of it. But yeah, they are edible. It's amazing how much of the food that's out there is edible. But not just edible by us. When you see primroses popping up in little patches on the bank, I often used to wonder, how on earth did they get there? Are their seeds blowing like those willow trees we talked about a minute ago? But what happens with them, and it's an amazing little relationship. This is only recently enough discovered. That their seeds have a little parcel of food, a little sweet bit of food on the outside of each seed. And ants know this. Ants have figured this out. And ants crawl over the primrose when they go to seed, when the flowers are gone, they've been fertilised. And they collect the seeds and they bring them back to their little ant burrows and they bury them there. And then they use them as a food source. But it's only the outside of the seed that they use as a food source. And then they ignore the rest of it. And that little seed has been perfectly moved around, distributed and planted by the ants. And hence, that's how it's popping up. So when you see it on your bank, that little edible flower that's on the bank, it is a tiny little beetle that's made it possible for it to be fertilised, and it's a tiny little ant that has planted it and spread it around the place. And they'll spread and spread in your garden if you have them. They'll just keep going and keep going. They're an amazing thing.
And you mentioned the types of yellow, or it's yellow and lemon, as I would see it. But there's different colours of them as well. There's a variety of colours. In fact, I've seen blood red ones and I've seen orange ones, and so there's different.
Yeah, there's a lot of different cultivars, and there's ones that are actually kind of different species altogether, which you can get in your garden centre, and they will be hardier, and they'll come out at different times, and or not necessarily hardier, but they might last longer, come out at different times, but they won't be quite as well adapted to all of these various different bugs. Occasionally, our own little yellow or two-toned yellow primrose it will turn a different colour, all right. But an awful lot of the different coloured ones are actually kind of different, slightly different species, but related. A lovely thing, Shakespeare coined the term the primrose path, which I think is a lovely kind of term, and it means a lazy and pleasant route through life. And at the moment, there's all sorts of strange feelings going on all over the place, but every now and then, when we can enjoy the song of the Willow Warbler or the sight of the primroses, we can feel we can hop onto that lazy and pleasant route, even if it's only for a few moments.
Okay, and naturenorthwest.ie, is that the website?
naturenorthwest.ie, yeah, and you'll get the last recordings that we did. I've been popping them up, and also I've been popping up some links to different information on some of the topics we've talked about, if anybody wants to explore that. And one thing I discovered recently, actually, which is well worth looking up, is Clún na Dór. Clún na Dór have on their Facebook page, they have a live feed to a blue tit nest, and they're putting up little posts about what's happening there, and it's fascinating to see. It's at a very early stage. I'm not sure if they've even laid any eggs yet. They might have perhaps laid one or two, but you can get to watch all that action right there from the comfort of your home. But naturenorthwest.ie, and you'll get information on what we've been talking about.
Angus, thank you very much. Take care, and we'll chat to you next week.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you.